What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello everyone, welcome back again to Faith Undone, where we learn to leave the old behind and really begin walking in the new. This is our 10th podcast, and we're in the double digits now, so it's kind of legit. As you can probably tell, I've got a bit of a Kermit the Frog voice. Allergies are just killing me right now. And periodically in this podcast, you will hear Legos dropping to the floor. That's Kason in the other room. He had the day off. But we're just hanging out now, and I thought I better do this while I have a chance. I wanted to share some thoughts, especially after this Easter weekend. So there's a lot of interesting concepts and things that happen during Easter. And from an outside perspective, Easter Sunday has the potential to seem a bit odd at best. Easter is a time church communities, they come together, they act out the crucifixion of Jesus by the Roman Empire. And most of the time they'll have these 12 bearded adult disciples play the part of these teenage Torah students. And they'll have a Jesus character that looks more like a Hollywood Russell Brand than a Middle Eastern Jewish rabbi. And they'll go through the last hours, the dinner in an upstairs room where Brand will wash these men's feet. In the Garden of Gethsemane, they'll have this another man in red pajamas. He'll tempt Jesus to leave Jerusalem, and then they'll have this trial where a bunch of people, they'll start chanting a death sentence, which is going to lead everyone into the crucifixion with Russell Brand. The lookalike, he'll be wearing an adult diaper, and he's whipped and tortured on a cross. And in some services or plays, they'll even have this great battle with Jesus and Satan in hell, which, wherever that is, maybe Florida. And Jesus will rip away a key, which we're to understand is like the actual key of death. And afterwards, there will be a resurrection scene where Jesus will roll away a stone and this rockin' 80s praise music with Steve Green blasts in the air. And afterwards, I love this, these same families, they'll join together and they'll hunt for Easter eggs and chocolate bunnies. So yeah, from the outside, this could look really odd. Children, families, young and old, all coming together to watch a murder and hunt for Easter eggs. So for the next couple of weeks, I want to delve into what the cross really meant for that early church, because we have gone way far off track from what these original writers were actually intending this whole story to be. And so we're going to go beyond the bunnies and into a deeper understanding of sacrificial love without using the old worn-out ways of viewing the text, and I would argue barbaric ways. So for many people, the reason for Jesus' death, it kind of looks like this scenario. So there's this guy, and we'll call him Nathan. And he's going to metaphorically represent us. So Nathan, he knew he was a very bad boy, and God was going to punish him. And it would be a punishment harder than he could imagine because his sins were so terrible. And all of a sudden, Jesus, he comes in before God and he says, hey, why don't you punish me instead of Nathan? And so Nathan watches Jesus beaten, just brutally beaten and murdered by the Divine Father. Does this sound pretty messed up to you? Can you imagine this? And then can you imagine having to watch someone else get the hell beat out of them because of you? And who was ultimately asking for this? Like, who created the whole idea of this? Well, God? A God of love felt his son being murdered is the best way he could think of to turn everything around? Doesn't pain that God that he has to watch his son being murdered? And imagine all the guilt and the shame this would create for Nathan having to watch this. I mean, no wonder religion is so filled with so much guilt and shame when your whole theology revolves around this kind of thinking. I think it's crazy, to be honest with you. And someone might ask, how do we even get here? And I would argue we got here by courting something called original sin, which we've discussed in some detail in the past. But here's the beauty. Science tells us right now we are actually evolving. We're growing in knowledge. We're growing in an awareness of life. We're not devolving. We're not moving backwards toward caveman awareness. No, that's not reality. We are not devolving. We're not getting worse. And so if this story is actually not about the devolving of people needing rescued, it's not about my guilt and shame needing to be paid for by a wrathful God, then there must be something else to the Jesus story that we've missed. The idea that God is going to punish Jesus instead of Nathan should cause us to be pretty repulsed. And that's not a God of love like so many Christian churches claim. It's not a God whose characteristics are observed in the life of Jesus. It makes God this monster. Jesus would be this masochist, and it causes Christians to live lives of guilt and shame rather than freedom and maturity. And the church has lived in guilt, hasn't it? And again, it's actually very economical for them. And so it's almost like the gift that keeps giving. So why would someone or something need to pay with their lives? Why does this God demand blood? Anyone's head starting to hurt yet? Here's what I would remind you. The people writing this, they saw the world very differently than you and I did. They're compiling these pieces during a time when they're in exile. They're looking back at their story. And their story, it goes like this. Israel just left slavery. It's all this generation's known. And they've forgotten much of their story. And so they've forgotten who they are, and they've begun to assimilate to the tribes in which they've been held captive, which makes absolute sense. And so those tribes all have ways in which they view the world. The ideas of sacrifice to the gods, this was nothing new. Every tribe was doing this to some degree. Sacrifice and worship to the gods, this was a way of life. When you look back historically, you'll see there were some really gruesome tribes that sacrificed their virgins, firstborn, their brides, and concubines, along with livestock. They did all of this because they wanted the gods to be appeased. And they desired blessings from the gods and not curses. And so somewhere, someone decided that a good gift, a worthy gift, would be a life. And somewhere along the line, Israel picks up on this tradition. And it's interesting because some historians, they've actually said, we think it came from this point in time. Some historians have actually pointed out that there's a deep connection between Ramses II and the Israelites in relation to the idea of sacrifices and temples where the sacrifices took place. So hold with me. I promise this is going to be interesting. Ramses II was known for, and he was very proud for his battles against the Hittites. And it was his defining moment. And it's actually carved everywhere in the ruins. And historically, the reality is, at best, the battle was a draw. But he built his entire reign on a pretty shaky story. But here's something interesting I found. Because when you look at the battle pictures drawn on these walls, you'll notice something really interesting, a really huge connection between Israel and the Egyptians. There are these drawings of this mobile war temple. It had these shields that surrounded the camp, making this large rectangle shape. And there were sacrifice stations all set up at the entrance. And inside the large rectangle shape, there was another smaller rectangle that's divided into two. Outside the smaller rectangle is a wash basin where the priests would wash before they'd walk into the area they considered holy. And the first part of the smaller rectangle was a place in which the priests would go and they would honor Ramses by lighting candles and worshiping him. And then Ramses lived in the second area of the tent, curtained off, where his bed was placed in the middle, and on either side there were these wings, which were these representations of Horus. So come on, anyone who's ever read the Bible, ever read about how the Israelites had this mobile temple with an inner and outer court, a holy place, and a curtain dividing the most holy place, and inside the holy place there were these wings on either side where God's presence was. Right now you're thinking, whoa, wait a second, this is strange. What do I do with this, right? How did we end up like this? Where did the temple come from? The answer, I think, is fairly easy, actually. If you're willing to remember that Israel, like so many other tribes and empires during this time, they're learning to navigate the world in new ways. And so they all still see the world as the gods up there, man down here, and the gods have to be appeased for our crops to grow and disasters to be avoided. So for the Israelites, when they leave Egypt, they use what they know. Of course, their worship of their God is going to look similar. It's all they've known. So what's interesting here is that the writers and the priests of this time, they create a temple. The Israelites create a temple, but they do it a little differently. So rather than human sacrifices, they felt that their God was calling them to worship by a sacrifice of an animal instead. The lamb needed to be physically perfect, no bruises or markings, and they felt this lamb or sometimes a goat or whatever had to be like morally perfect because it doesn't make decisions and so it's not sinned, right? So they, again, very barbaric, but they had this special high celebration in which they would bring an animal before everyone and they would symbolically place their guilt and their fears, all of those things, all of it on the animal. And it would then be placed, it would be sacrificed and then brought into the most holy place where this God would accept this and offer them grace. That was the idea. And again, I get it. It's very ancient, barbaric, because it is. It's how they function. It's how they view the world. But what's interesting is how we've often missed the point here. Because for these ancient people, they began viewing this lamb as Israel, the suffering servant that took on the pains and the injustice of the world, and then offered it to this God, in hopes that repair might be done. And this is a little different than the neighboring empires. So the lamb becomes a symbol of what Israel was. They were a tribe that was constantly being beaten down, exiled, overcome by other tribes, misused, abused. They felt they were innocent. So the sacrifice was really a picture of how they suffered in the world. And so how did they suffer? Well, they suffered like lambs. They were beginning to choose not to fight, not to return violence with violence. And yeah, it was a constant up and down. They would get it and then they wouldn't. But they had all these minor prophets standing up and talking to people, asking them, stop the escalation of violence. Beat your swords into garden tools. And so Israel becomes the suffering servant, the lamb. And I would argue this is evident in one of the most commonly quoted passages in Isaiah, which we know today as like Handel's Messiah. And so Isaiah 53, it was not written to refer to Jesus. I'm sorry, but any theologian worth their salt will admit this. The suffering servant described here was Israel. It's what the scribe, the prophetic voice, is calling Israel to be. So listen to a couple of these things. And if you're familiar with the Easter story, you'll be like, hey, wait, there's some similarities there. And so verse 2 of this chapter in Isaiah 53, it says this, "For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of parched ground. He had no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him." Again, this is talking about Israel. So again, Israel, he was despised and broken of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And like one whom men hid their face, despised, we did not esteem him. Surely our grief he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. And watch this now. Again, you can see some of the borrowing from the New Testament when they looked at this. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The chastising for those well-being fell upon him. And it keeps going. Like we're like sheep fell astray. It keeps going. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. Never once does he open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he's taken away. Grave assigned with wicked men. It keeps going. And again, you'll get this. They take his clothing and they divide it among themselves. All of this, you can hear it. Now, what's beautiful about this is that later on, again, the writer of Matthew, some 30 years after the death and resurrection story of Jesus is spread around, he'll actually write it. And we'll show the beautiful connection of the suffering servant to Jesus by quoting this in his description of the crucifixion. And what we see here in this moment with Jesus is that Jesus becomes the embodiment of the suffering servant. The servant, Israel, who is broken, oppressed, would seem to be despised by God, right? Yet in the midst of this oppression, he looks like a lamb. He looks like Israel, who offers itself up to the oppressive forces of the day. And what is Israel's response? What is Jesus' response? What should our response be? It's forgive them. We're called to be like Israel, the embodiment of love. And remember that for these people during the time of Jesus, they're under Roman occupation. And the people writing the Old Testament, they're under Babylonian occupation. And so they're asking the very real question, how do we respond to injustice? How do we respond to this hate and being wickedly treated by these different people? How do we respond? With violence or like a lamb? So watch this. When Israel is sacrificing lambs, assuming their God is behind it, accepting it, being appeased by it, the reality was that the idea of their God is better understood as the sacrifice, as the lamb, the embodiment of love. Love is sacrificing oneself so that others might live. The embodiment of love was there the whole time. And sometimes they missed it. They missed it. For the Jewish people, the meaning becomes really obvious. And there's a point where a curtain is torn in two, and that actually has a really powerful meaning. So catch this. So after the death of Jesus, the writers tell the audience that the curtain between the holy place and most holy place is torn in two. And here's the thing. When it's torn in two, the assumption would be that God's presence would be there and it would just destroy everyone because it's so powerful. But what happened is, when the curtain's torn in two, there's nothing behind it. There's nothing there, which would cause them or anyone to say, well, then where is our God? Where is the thing that brings life? And to the early church, the gospel writers, what they're trying to tell people is this: where we find life, where we find restoration, is not in that anymore. We don't find it there. We are evolving. How we find life is to live like that. And they pointed to the Lamb. See, the cross was never a moment in which Jesus offers himself up instead of you to an angry monster God to atone for your sins. We created that insane theology. Life and repair is not found in the murder of an innocent person or an animal. Life is found right there in the act of love, laying down your life for another person, laying down your life, choosing not to escalate violence. The Lamb is the presence of what brings life. It's what Israel was called to be. So when you finally see it, it changes everything for you. So here, Israel, you've made a temple dedicated to worshiping their gods, believing their God's presence was there in these traditions and the candles, there in this one special room, when the reality was that the real lesson, the real power, what they were called to be, was right there in the Lamb. And I would argue that's what we're called to do. We're called to live that kind of life like Jesus, the suffering servant, the Lamb, the atoning offering, not to God, but to one another. Jesus was, much like Israel, the lamb that was slain by oppressive forces, slain by mob mentality, slain by injustice. So in the face of injustice, like Israel, again, we are called not to escalate violence and hate, but to receive it with love. Recycle it. Recycle hate with love. Become a living, breathing embodiment of love. And so I have this story. A friend of mine, my old roommate, is a therapist. And he's got all of these just really incredible stories about helping people move into wholeness. And he told me one day after a really difficult session with someone that he thought he almost had to call the cops that day. And so I asked him, well, what happened? And so he told me, as he was sitting in his office, like finishing up the last of his paperwork, preparing to go home, this big burly man walks in. And he has this angry look in his eyes. And he asks, are you so-and-so, my wife's therapist? And my friend is worried, but he decided to stand his ground. He said, yes, I am, but anything more is confidential. And so the man stood over my friend and begins just pouring out every angry four-letter word he can think of. He basically begins telling my friend that therapists are a joke. No self-respecting man would work in such a joke of an occupation. And then he turned on his wife, started vomiting all sorts of filth about her. All the while, my friend is sitting patiently, just absorbing it all. He just sat, listened. And what happened next is beautiful. He said the man started to slow down. And then my friend asked him, "Is there anything else that you're frustrated about?" And the man, of course, just immediately takes the bait, jumps into his work, his kids, starts talking about his parents and his childhood. And he finally sits down, puts his head in his palms, and he starts weeping. And my friend just sat there absorbing it all. And finally the man looks up and he says, I just don't want to lose her. And my friend, my wise friend, after absorbing all of that, allowing the man to face his own issues by just taking all the anger and pain that the man had to throw at him, my friend says, "You know what? I think we can begin now. I think we can move toward healing." Isn't that so beautiful? And I think that's what we're called to do sometimes in the world. In order to bring healing to the world, healing, not rescue. What if we became the suffering servant? The servant that was willing to absorb the hurt and the pain, to embody love in the face of an enemy, a violent mob, an angry husband. We, the suffering servants, are called to be this atonement, kippur, the embodiment of love. So what if next Easter we put down the eggs and the bunnies, the passion skits and the crucifixes, and we actually went out and attempted to bring real healing to our communities? We attempted to start conversations rather than arguments. We took time to ask for forgiveness where we've hurt others and forgive those who've hurt us. I think when we do that, we start to look human again. And that, and only that, is going to cause humanity to truly become human, to become one. Love, forgiveness, mercy will make incomplete people whole again. And so I hope you enjoyed this podcast about the cross, and we will actually continue this conversation for a couple more weeks about what the cross means and what it shouldn't mean. And as always, please visit my page, tonywerfel.com. And if you'd like to participate in being a donor and helping just keep this thing afloat, visit my Patreon page. And I hope you have a great week. And hopefully you, like me, will overcome your allergies and you'll be living free and breathing. Take care, everyone. Blessings. Bye.